Standing in the grand foyer of Oakhaven Estate, clutching a stack of canceled wedding invitations, I watched the man I loved slip a 10-carat diamond onto another woman's finger. Preston didn't just break my heart. He humiliated me, discarding our 5-year relationship because my bank account wasn't padded enough to save his crumbling inheritance. He thought he was trading up for a billionaire heiress. He had absolutely no idea he had just evicted the actual rightful owner of his entire world. Romance, they say, is blind. In my case, it was practically comatose. My name is Amelia Hastings. For as long as I could remember, I was the quiet, hard-working girl from a tiny, drafty cottage in Cornwall. I was raised by my adoptive mother, Margaret, a fiercely protective woman who ran a local bakery and taught me the value of a hard-earned pound. I knew nothing of luxury, high society, or the ruthless games played by the ultra-wealthy. I was content with my vintage sweaters, my job as an archivist at the London Historical Society, and my quiet life. Then I met Preston Charles Parker. We bumped into each other, literally, at a charity gala in Mayfair that my workplace had forced me to attend. I was carrying a stack of historical exhibition programs. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne. The collision resulted in a ruined tuxedo jacket and a flustered apology on my end. But Preston just laughed. He was devastatingly handsome, with tousled, sandy hair, piercing hazel eyes, and that effortless, aristocratic charm that comes from centuries of breeding. He didn't yell. Instead, he helped me pick up the programs, asked for my name, and within 24 hours had sent 24 white roses to my tiny flat in Camden. For the first 3 years, our relationship felt like a modern-day fairy tale. Preston was the heir to Oakhaven Estate, a sprawling 300-year-old manor in Surrey that boasted 40 rooms, manicured hedge mazes, and a private lake. But despite his grand background, he seemed to love my simplicity. He called me his grounding force. When his father passed away suddenly, leaving the estate in Preston's hands, I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him sort through the mountains of paperwork. That was when I first realized the Parker empire was built on a crumbling foundation. On paper, Preston was a multimillionaire. In reality, Oakhaven was hemorrhaging money. The roof needed £500,000 in repairs. The property taxes were astronomical, and the family trust had been severely depleted by his late father's terrible investments. I poured my heart into helping him. I created strict budgets, fired the overly expensive groundskeeping firm, and hired local contractors, and even spent my own weekends on my hands and knees in the estate's gardens, pulling weeds to save on labor costs. I gave him every ounce of my energy, my time, and my meager savings. And for a while, he seemed endlessly grateful. When he proposed to me on a rainy Tuesday in the Oakhaven Library, offering me a modest heirloom sapphire ring, I cried tears of pure joy. I thought we were a team. I thought we were building a future together. I should have paid closer attention to his mother, Brandy Parker. Brandy was a woman carved from ice and old money. She wore Chanel suits to breakfast and looked at me as if I were a particularly stubborn stain on her antique Persian rugs. From the moment Preston put that ring on my finger, Brandy went on the offensive. "Amelia, dear," she drawled one evening over a tense dinner in the formal dining room, her fork delicately hovering over her sea bass. "Have you given any thought to the floral arrangements? I assume you'll be doing them yourself to save on costs. Given your background, I'm sure you're quite used to cutting corners." Preston would usually offer a weak defense. "Mother, leave her alone. Amelia is doing her best." But his defenses grew weaker as the estate's financial situation grew more dire. 6 months before our wedding, Brandy invited a family friend to stay at the estate for a fortnight. Enter Victoria Ashford. Victoria was the only daughter of Richard Ashford, an American tech tycoon who had recently relocated to London. She was everything I was not: loud, dripping in designer labels, and endlessly boastful about her father's private jets and offshore accounts. She drove a custom neon green Porsche and spoke to the estate staff as if they were indentured servants. "Oh, Amelia," Victoria simpered on her first afternoon at Oakhaven, eyeing my practical wool cardigan. "You're so quaint. Preston tells me you work in a library." How adorable. I couldn't imagine working. Daddy just set up a new trust fund for my 25th birthday. It's so exhausting managing wealth, you know. I tried to brush her off, attributing her presence to Brandy's snobbery. But I began to notice a shift in Preston. He started spending more time in the billiards room with Victoria, drinking scotch and laughing at her loud jokes. When I tried to talk to him about our catering budget, his eyes would glaze over. "Amelia, please," he snapped one night when I pointed out we couldn't afford the imported truffles his mother demanded for the reception. "I have the weight of a legacy on my shoulders. I don't want to argue about mushrooms right now. Victoria's father was just telling me about a potential investment opportunity that could save Oakhaven. I need to focus on that." I swallowed my hurt and nodded. I thought he was just stressed. I thought he was just desperately trying to save his childhood home. I didn't realize that the investment opportunity Richard Ashford was offering wasn't a business deal. It was a dowry. It happened exactly 21 days before our wedding. I had just come from my final dress fitting in London. It wasn't a designer gown, just a simple, elegant ivory silk dress I had bought off the rack and had tailored to fit perfectly. Still, holding the garment bag, I felt a flutter of nervous excitement. I took the train down to Surrey, eager to surprise Preston and maybe steal a quiet moment together before the chaotic final weeks of wedding planning consumed us. When I walked through the heavy oak front doors of Oakhaven, the house was eerily silent. Usually there was the bustle of staff, or the sound of Brandy loudly complaining about the temperature. Today, there was nothing. I walked into the grand foyer and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting at the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase were my 2 worn suitcases. Beside them was a cardboard box containing the few books and personal items I'd kept in Preston's study. My heart did a strange, painful flutter. "Preston?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. Footsteps sounded from the drawing room. Preston emerged, wearing a tailored navy suit I had never seen before. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Behind him, holding a crystal flute of champagne, was Brandy. And lounging on the velvet settee just inside the room, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression, was Victoria Ashford. "Preston, what is this?" I asked, my voice trembling as I pointed at my luggage. "Did you pack my things? Are we moving rooms?" Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs. He looked everywhere but at my face. "Amelia, we need to have a very difficult conversation. Please, sit down." "I don't want to sit down," I said, my grip tightening on my wedding dress bag. "Why are my bags packed?" Brandy stepped forward, a triumphant, venomous smile playing on her thin lips. "Because, you silly girl, your services are no longer required here. The wedding is canceled." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. All the air rushed out of my lungs. I looked at Preston, waiting for him to correct his mother, to tell her to shut up, to defend me. But he just stared at the floor. "Preston?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Tell me she's lying." He finally looked up, and the absolute coldness in his hazel eyes shattered something fundamental inside me. "She's not lying, Amelia. I'm sorry, but this isn't working out." "Not working out?" I gasped. "We're getting married in 3 weeks. The invitations are sent. The caterer is paid. I've spent the last 3 years of my life trying to help you save this estate. What do you mean it's not working out?" Victoria let out a theatrical sigh and stood up, walking over to Preston and wrapping her manicured hand around his arm. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Preston, just tell the poor charity case the truth. She's embarrassing herself." Victoria raised her left hand, and there, sparkling under the foyer chandelier, was a massive, gaudy diamond ring. It easily dwarfed the modest sapphire Preston had given me. "We're engaged, Amelia," Victoria said, her voice dripping in faux pity. "Daddy is paying off all the debts on Oakhaven. He's injecting £10 million into the estate tomorrow. In exchange, Preston and I are getting married next month. A proper wedding, of course. Not the cheap little garden party you were planning." I stumbled back, my vision blurring with hot tears. I looked at Preston, the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed everything for. "You sold yourself. I choked out. "You're canceling our wedding, throwing away 5 years for a bailout?" Preston's jaw tightened. "It's not just a bailout, Amelia. It's my legacy. Oak Haven has been in the Parker family for centuries. I couldn't lose it. You knew how bad the finances were. What could you possibly offer me? A librarian's salary? Good intentions? That doesn't fix a crumbling roof or pay off $3 million in back taxes." "I offered you my life," I screamed, the pain finally boiling over into rage. "I loved you. I worked my fingers to the bone for you and this rotting house. And you were compensated with a roof over your head and a taste of a lifestyle you could never otherwise afford," Brandy interrupted, her tone sharp as a razor. "Now, I suggest you take your little bags and your cheap dress and leave. My future daughter-in-law and I have a great deal of replanning to do." I stood there for a long moment, the humiliation burning my cheeks. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear Victoria's hair out. I wanted to smash the antique vases. But as I looked at the three of them, Preston, a coward hiding behind women, Brandy, a bitter old snob, and Victoria, a vapid checkbook, a sudden freezing calm washed over me. I realized I didn't want him. I didn't want any part of this toxic, hollow family. I carefully folded the garment bag containing my wedding dress and laid it over my suitcase. Without another word, I pulled off the sapphire engagement ring and tossed it. It hit the marble floor with a sharp clinch and rolled to a stop at Preston's expensive Italian leather shoes. "Keep it," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You clearly need the money more than I do." I grabbed my suitcases and walked out the heavy oak doors. It was pouring rain outside, a cliché I would have laughed at under different circumstances. I dragged my luggage down the 2-mile gravel driveway, soaking wet, shivering, and completely broken. I didn't look back. If I had, I would have seen the grand facade of Oak Haven standing tall and proud, oblivious to the fact that the universe was about to unleash a storm that would tear its very foundations apart. For the first month after the breakup, I existed as a ghost. I took an indefinite leave of absence from the Historical Society and retreated to Cornwall, moving back into the tiny, damp cottage my adoptive mother, Margaret, had left me when she passed away 3 years prior. It was isolated, perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the gray, churning sea. It was the perfect place to hide. I spent my days staring at the ocean, wrapped in Margaret's old quilts, crying until my eyes were swollen shut. The local gossip had reached me through the village grocer. Preston and Victoria's wedding was going to be the social event of the decade, featured in elite magazines. Victoria's father had indeed paid off the Parker debts, and Brandy was parading around London society, boasting about her son's brilliant match. The injustice of it tasted like ash in my mouth. I had been erased, discarded like trash. On a particularly miserable Tuesday, a heavy coastal storm battered the cottage. Around midnight, a steady drip, drip, drip roused me from a restless sleep. The roof in the hallway had finally given way, and rainwater was pooling on the floorboards. Sighing, I grabbed a bucket and a flashlight, realizing I needed to get up into the attic to patch the leak from the inside before it caused structural damage. The attic was a place I rarely visited. It was cramped, smelling of dust, dried lavender, and old paper. Margaret had used it for storage, keeping boxes of old bakery receipts and clothes she couldn't bear to throw away. I crawled over the wooden joists, shining my flashlight toward the source of the leak. As I moved a stack of old moldy blankets out of the way to reach the roof tiles, my foot caught on something hard. I directed the beam of light downward. Tucked away in the darkest corner of the eaves, hidden beneath a pile of rotting floorboards, was a heavy iron-bound cedar chest. It was locked with a rusted brass padlock. Curiosity pierced through my lingering depression. Margaret had never mentioned this chest. I climbed back down the ladder, fetched a heavy hammer from the kitchen utility drawer, and returned to the attic. It took 5 solid, echoing strikes to break the rusted padlock. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth to protect against the damp, was a smaller, beautifully crafted mahogany lockbox, a stack of leather-bound diaries, and a heavy velvet pouch. My hands trembled as I untied the velvet pouch. Inside lay a massive gold signet ring. The metal was cool to the touch and incredibly heavy. Engraved deeply into the gold was a crest I instantly recognized from my years as a historical archivist. A rampant lion holding a broken sword, flanked by twin roses. It was the crest of the Duchy of Somerset-Montclair. The Montclairs were one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most secretive aristocratic families in Europe, tracing their lineage back to the 14th century. They were effectively royalty, boasting vast land holdings, political influence, and a staggering fortune. But the main branch of the family had suffered a massive tragedy a quarter of a century ago. The heir to the dukedom, Lord William Montclair, and his wife had died in a horrific boating accident off the coast of Italy. Their infant daughter, the sole remaining heir to the primary bloodline, had vanished shortly after, presumed drowned or kidnapped. The tragedy had shaken the world. My breath hitched in my throat. I set the ring down and frantically grabbed the first leather-bound diary. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Margaret's. August 14th, 1999. I have done a terrible thing, but I had no choice. They were going to kill her, just like they killed William and Catherine. The accident was no accident. The Duke's brother orchestrated it to seize control of the estate. I was only the governess, but I swore to Catherine I would protect the child. I have taken her. We are fleeing to Cornwall. I have changed her name to Amelia Hastings. May God forgive me for stealing her birthright, but her life is worth more than titles. I dropped the diary. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely breathe. I wasn't Amelia Hastings, the charity case. I wasn't the orphaned girl from a drafty cottage. I was Amelia Catherine Diana Montclair. I was the missing Duchess. Panic, shock, and a bizarre sense of clarity crashed over me all at once. I dug deeper into the cedar chest, tearing away the oilcloth. At the bottom was a thick stack of legal documents, sealed with wax and preserved perfectly in protective sleeves. They were the original deeds, charters, and financial records Margaret had stolen from the Montclair estate to ensure my identity could one day be proven. I spent the next 14 hours sitting on the floor of the attic reading every single page. I read Margaret's meticulous accounts of my birth, my medical records, and the secret trust funds set up in my true name. But it was a document near the bottom of the stack that made my heart stop entirely. It was a land charter dated 1842. As a historian, reading archaic legal jargon was my specialty. My eyes scanned the yellowed parchment, tracing the elegant calligraphy. It was a lease agreement between the Duke of Somerset-Montclair and a minor nobleman named Arthur Parker. Oakhaven Estate, Surrey. My eyes widened as I read the terms. Oakhaven didn't belong to the Parkers. It never had. In 1842, Arthur Parker had fallen on hard times, and the Montclair family, as the ultimate landowners of that region, had granted him a 150-year lease on the manor and its surrounding lands, purely as a charitable favor. I did the math in my head. 1842 plus 150 years. 1992. The lease had expired in 1992. According to the strictly enforced ancient land laws documented in the charter, once the lease expired, the property, all its assets and all improvements made upon it, reverted fully and instantly back to the House of Montclair. The only way to renew the lease was with the signature of the reigning Duke or Duchess of Montclair. Since the family had been in chaos and the true heir, me, was missing, the renewal had never happened. The Parkers had been living there illegally for over 30 years. Preston didn't own Oakhaven. Brandy didn't own it. Victoria Ashford's father had just poured £10 million into an estate that belonged to me. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. It started small, a hysterical little sound, and grew into full-blown, tear-streaming laughter. The irony was so exquisite, so perfectly poetic, it almost felt staged. Preston had thrown me out into the rain because I was too poor for Oakhaven. He had no idea he had just evicted his landlord. By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in a first-class train car headed for London, the cedar chest securely at my feet. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. I was running entirely on adrenaline and a cold, crystallized need for justice. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go to the press. I went to the most terrifying, ruthless, and elite legal firm in London, Abernathy, Carmichael, and Hayes, the retainers for the House of Montclair. When I walked into their mahogany-paneled lobby in a damp coat, clutching a wooden box, the receptionist tried to shoo me away. "I'm sorry, miss, but Mr. Abernathy only sees clients by appointment," the snooty receptionist said, not looking up from her computer. I didn't argue. I simply opened my purse, pulled out the heavy gold signet ring, and placed it onto the glass desk with a heavy thud. The receptionist looked at the ring, her eyes widening in sheer horror, the crest of the missing heir. Within 60 seconds, 3 security guards and a pale, trembling senior partner were escorting me into the top-floor executive boardroom. Henry Abernathy was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and the sharp, calculating eyes of a hawk. He sat across from me at the massive conference table, meticulously examining the documents, the diaries, and the ring. A team of forensic experts and genealogists had already been summoned, but as Mr. Abernathy read Margaret's diary, his hands began to shake. He looked up at me, taking in my face. "You have your mother's eyes," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "For 25 years we thought you were dead. The usurper branch of your family has been trying to claim the main estate for decades, but we held them off, hoping, praying." He took a deep breath, regaining his professional composure. "Your Grace, welcome back." "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice shockingly calm. "But before we deal with my uncle and the primary estate, I have a much smaller, more immediate piece of business I need you to handle." I slid the 1842 lease agreement across the table. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses and read the document. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Ah, the Oakhaven lease. We knew it had expired, but the legalities of reclaiming it required the signature of the true heir to execute the eviction. The Parkers have been ignoring our notices for a decade, hiding behind expensive lawyers." "Not anymore," I said, leaning forward. "Preston Parker is marrying a woman named Victoria Ashford in 2 weeks at that estate. I want them out. I want the property seized, and I want every single penny that has been fraudulently invested into my property documented." Mr. Abernathy's smile widened. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Martha, cancel my appointments for the rest of the week, and draft an immediate writ of seizure for Oakhaven Estate. We are going hunting. Reclaiming a stolen dukedom does not happen overnight, but money, elite influence, and an ironclad legal team certainly grease the wheels of justice." Over the next 72 hours, my life became a whirlwind of secure medical facilities and endless meetings. Dr. Gregory Hartman, a premier geneticist affiliated with the Crown, fast-tracked my DNA sample, comparing it against the preserved medical records of the late Duke William Montclair. When the results came back at a 99.99% match, Henry Abernathy pulled a monogrammed silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and dabbed at his eyes. The entire law firm of Abernathy, Carmichael, and Hayes shifted into a war footing. For 25 years they had been fighting a bitter defensive battle to keep my usurping uncle, Lord Charles, from liquidating the Montclair assets. Now they had their rightful duchess, and they were ready to unleash decades of pent-up legal fury. But first, we had to deal with Preston. Sitting in the top-floor executive suite, Mr. Abernathy outlined his strategy, laying out a series of documents on the polished table. "We could serve the Parkers with an immediate eviction notice today, Your Grace," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice laced with professional malice. "However, I have been reviewing the public financial disclosures regarding Mr. Richard Ashford's bailout of the estate." He handed me a dossier. "Ashford is notoriously ruthless, but his lawyers are remarkably sloppy. They assumed Oakhaven was a freehold property because the Parkers have falsely claimed it as such since 1992. Ashford is scheduled to wire the £10 million directly into the Oakhaven Estate Trust this coming Friday, exactly 48 hours before the wedding ceremony." I looked at the older lawyer, a slow realization dawning on me. "And according to the 1842 lease..." "Precisely." Mr. Abernathy grinned, looking like a shark smelling a drop of chum in the water. Clause 14, subsection B. Any financial injections, structural improvements, or liquid assets deposited into the estate's primary operating trust automatically become the permanent property of the sovereign landowner upon termination or default of the lease. If we wait until Friday afternoon to freeze the accounts, Mr. Ashford's £10 million legally becomes yours. It was a devastating trap. If I had interrupted them immediately, Preston would have merely been broke. But if I waited, Richard Ashford, a man who destroyed corporate rivals for sport, would lose £10 million because Preston and Brandy had lied to him about owning the property. Ashford wouldn't just be angry, he would annihilate the Parkers. "We wait," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "Let them have their rehearsal dinner. Let them transfer the funds. We strike on the wedding day." To execute the plan flawlessly, we needed a calculated approach. Mr. Abernathy organized a three-pronged strike, asset freezing. At exactly 4 p.m. on Friday, banking magistrates would quietly freeze the Oakhaven Trust, locking Ashford's newly transferred funds inside. Media blackout. Injunctions were prepared to prevent my uncle, Lord Charles, from discovering my return until after the Oakhaven matter was publicly settled. The element of surprise. A team of high court enforcement officers, bailiffs, would accompany us to the estate to enforce the immediate vacate order. While the lawyers drafted the warrants, I underwent a transformation. I couldn't walk into Oakhaven looking like the exhausted, heartbroken librarian they had thrown out into the rain. Mr. Abernathy gave me unlimited access to the Montclair discretionary funds and set me up in the penthouse suite of the Savoy. I hired a personal stylist, a woman named Clara Davies who usually dressed foreign dignitaries. Gone were my sensible wool cardigans and scuffed loafers. Clara dressed me in a tailored blood-red Alexander McQueen power suit that fit like a second skin. My unruly hair was professionally cut into a sleek, sharp bob. I slipped my feet into black Christian Louboutin stilettos. As I looked in the penthouse mirror on Saturday morning, the day of the wedding, I hardly recognized myself. The meek, accommodating Amelia Hastings was dead. Staring back at me was Amelia Montclair, Duchess of Somerset Montclair, and I was about to ruin the social event of the season. I picked up my late mother's heavy gold signet ring, slid it onto my index finger, and walked out to the waiting fleet of blacked-out Range Rovers. Saturday afternoon at Oakhaven Estate was a scene ripped straight from the pages of Tatler magazine. As our motorcade pulled past the wrought iron front gates, which had been foolishly left open for arriving guests, I could see the immense scale of Victoria's vanity. The manicured lawns were covered in massive white marquees. Thousands of imported white orchids were strung from the ancient oak trees. A string quartet played softly on the terrace, and nearly 300 of London and New York's wealthiest elite sat in gilded chairs arranged on the back lawn, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Mr. Abernathy sat beside me in the back of the lead vehicle, holding a thick leather briefcase. Behind us were two vans filled with uniformed high court enforcement officers, led by a burly, no-nonsense man named Inspector Miller. "Showtime, Your Grace," Mr. Abernathy murmured as the vehicles crunched to a halt on the gravel driveway, right behind the rows of seated guests. The low hum of aristocratic chatter abruptly died as the heavy doors of our vehicles slammed shut. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd of fascinators and mourning suits. I stepped out of the Range Rover, the heels of my Louboutins sinking slightly into the pristine gravel. The red McQueen suit was a blazing siren amidst the sea of pastel wedding attire. Preston was standing at the altar beneath a floral arch, wearing a bespoke mourning suit. Beside him stood the vicar. When Preston saw me, all the color drained from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Sitting in the front row, Brandy Parker stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her chair, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, her shrill voice echoing across the silent lawn. "Security! Remove this pathetic girl immediately. How dare you show your face here, Amelia?" I ignored her, walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. Mr. Abernathy flanked my right side, and Inspector Miller flanked my left. 4 more bailiffs fanned out behind us. The guests parted like the Red Sea, muttering in shock. Victoria Ashford emerged from the manor house at that exact moment, ready for her grand entrance. She was practically suffocating in a massive Vera Wang gown dripping in Swarovski crystals. When she saw me standing in the middle of her aisle, she let out a shriek. "You!" Victoria screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Are you insane? You psycho ex-girlfriend! Get off my property before I have my father's security break your legs." Richard Ashford, a heavy-set man with a flushed face and a terrifying scowl, stepped out of the front row, snapping his fingers at 2 large bodyguards. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're pulling, young lady, but you have 5 seconds to leave before things get violent." I stopped 10 feet from the altar. I looked at Preston, who was physically trembling, then at Brandy, and finally at Richard Ashford. "Mr. Ashford," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the hushed crowd, "I assure you I have no intention of ruining your daughter's wedding. She is more than welcome to marry this man. However, she cannot do it on my property." Brandy let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your property? Have you lost your tiny mind? You are a penniless orphan. You own nothing." I snapped my fingers. "Mr." Abernathy unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the massive official red wax seal of the High Court of London. "Allow me to introduce myself," Mr. Abernathy projected, addressing the crowd with the booming voice of a seasoned litigator. "I am Henry Abernathy, senior partner at Abernathy, Carmichael, and Hayes. I represent the Duchy of Somerset Montclair, and this," he gestured to me, "is Her Grace, Amelia Catherine Diana Montclair, rightful Duchess and sole heir to the Montclair estate." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the garden. The Montclair tragedy was legendary in these circles. The murmurs erupted into a chaotic buzz. "That's a lie!" Brandy shrieked, her Chanel hat sitting askew on her head. "It's a pathetic, desperate lie." "The Crown's geneticists and the High Court disagree, Mrs. Parker." "Mr." Abernathy replied smoothly, handing a thick packet of paper to a stunned Preston. "As does the law. You see, the Parkers do not own Oakhaven. They never have. They have been occupying this land on an 1842 charitable lease granted by the Montclair family, a lease that expired in 1992. Preston stared at the papers in his hands, his eyes darting frantically over the legal jargon. No, my father said the deed was secure. He said, "Your father lied, Mr. Parker," I said, stepping closer to the altar. "He hid the expiration notices to maintain his status in society, and you perpetuated the fraud, which brings us to today's business." I turned to look at Richard Ashford, whose face was rapidly transitioning from red to a dangerous mottled purple. "Mr. Ashford," I said sweetly, "I understand you wired £10 million into the Oakhaven Estate Trust yesterday afternoon to clear the property's debts." "I did," Ashford growled, his eyes narrowing, "to secure my daughter's future home." "Unfortunately for you," Mr. Abernathy interjected, "under the strict forfeiture clauses of the 1842 lease, any funds deposited into the estate's trust by an occupying tenant instantly become the property of the landowner. The accounts were frozen by judicial order at 4 p.m. yesterday. Your £10 million now belongs to the Duchy of Somerset Montclair." Total absolute silence fell over the lawn. You could have heard a pin drop. Richard Ashford slowly turned his head to look at Preston and Brandy. The sheer murderous intent in the billionaire's eyes was terrifying. "You told me you owned this estate," Ashford said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "You showed me fraudulent deeds. You stole £10 million from me." "Richard, please," Brandy panicked, holding her hands up. "We didn't know. I swear to you, we thought it was ours." "Daddy, do something," Victoria wailed, stomping her foot so hard she tripped over her massive train. "Make them leave. It's my wedding day." "Shut up, Victoria," Ashford roared, making his daughter flinch. He pointed a meaty finger at Preston. "I'm going to bury you. I will tie you up in litigation until you are bankrupt, and then I will have you thrown in a cell for wire fraud." Preston looked like he was about to vomit. He looked at me, his hazel eyes pleading, completely stripped of his usual arrogant charm. "Amelia, please. We were together for 5 years. You can't do this to me." "You canceled our wedding because I wasn't rich enough for you, Preston," I said, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "You threw me out into the rain like garbage so you could sell yourself to the highest bidder." I stepped back and nodded to Inspector Miller. The burly enforcement officer stepped forward, flanked by his men. "Preston Parker, Brandy Parker," Miller announced, his voice carrying the heavy weight of the law. "By order of the High Court, you are hereby served with a notice of immediate seizure and eviction. You have exactly 1 hour to collect your personal clothing and vacate the premises. If you are found on this property after 60 minutes, you will be arrested for trespassing." "1 hour?" Brandy gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. But my antiques, my furniture, the paintings." "All furnishings and fixtures left on the property after the 1992 lease expiration are legally considered abandoned assets and belong to the estate," Mr. Abernathy clarified cheerfully. "You may take the clothes on your backs and a single suitcase each. Nothing more." The garden descended into absolute pandemonium. Guests were standing up, taking photos with their phones, and rushing toward the exits to avoid the incoming legal crossfire. Victoria was on the grass, sobbing hysterically into her Vera Wang dress, while her father screamed furiously into his cell phone, ordering his corporate lawyers to prepare for war. I stood on the terrace, watching the chaotic, beautiful destruction of the people who had tried to break me. But as satisfying as it was to watch Preston and Brandy being escorted into the manor by bailiffs to pack their meager belongings, I knew this was only the first battle. Oakhaven was mine, but the true war for the Montclair Empire and the confrontation with the uncle who had murdered my parents was just beginning. The sight of Preston Parker trudging down the 2-mile gravel driveway of Oakhaven Estate, dragging a single scuffed suitcase through the mud, was a masterclass in poetic justice. Just weeks prior, I had walked that exact path, blinded by tears and completely broken. Now, it was his turn. Brandy followed closely behind him, clutching a singular vintage Hermes handbag to her chest as if it were a life preserver. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her designer mascara running down her cheeks in jagged black rivers. Behind them, Richard Ashford's fleet of security SUVs blocked the gates, ensuring the Parkers couldn't beg for a ride. Ashford had already frozen all of Preston's personal bank accounts pending a massive civil suit for wire fraud. Preston wasn't just homeless, he was effectively destitute. I watched them from the grand balcony of the master suite, a cup of Earl Grey tea warming my hands. Suddenly, Preston stopped. He dropped his suitcase, turned around, and sprinted back past the bailiffs, dodging Inspector Miller's outstretched arm. He ran until he was standing directly below the balcony, his chest heaving, his perfect sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. "Amelia!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Amelia, please! I know you're up there. Let me talk to you. Just 5 minutes." I stepped out to the edge of the stone balustrade and looked down at him. "You have exactly 60 seconds before I have Inspector Miller arrest you for trespassing, Preston." He fell to his knees on the manicured grass. "I made a mistake. I was blind, Amelia. My mother pushed me into it, and I was terrified of losing the estate. I didn't want Victoria. I never loved her. I love you. We can fix this. You own Oakhaven now. We can be together just like we planned. I'll marry you tomorrow." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer audacity, the staggering delusion of the man I had once thought was my soulmate. He didn't love me. He loved the estate, and now that I was the key to the estate, he was trying to use the exact same romantic manipulation that had kept me doing his dirty work for 5 years. "You don't love me, Preston," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the crisp afternoon air. "You love the bricks of this house. You love the easy life. But that life is over. I am not your savior. I am your landlord, and your lease is up." I paused, letting the cold reality sink into his panicked eyes. "Inspector Miller, Remove this trespasser." Two massive bailiffs grabbed Preston by the arms, dragging him, kicking and screaming toward the front gates. I turned away, walking back into the warmth of the manor, finally closing the book on Preston Parker. But the victory at Oakhaven was merely a skirmish. The real war was waiting in London. 48 hours later, I was sitting in the heavily fortified underground archives of Abernathy, Carmichael, and Hayes. Spread across a massive oak table were decades of financial records, wiretap transcripts, and private investigator reports. Henry Abernathy stood at the head of the table, a laser pointer in hand, illuminating a complex web of shell companies projected onto a screen. "Your uncle, Lord Charles Montclair, is not a foolish man," Mr. Abernathy explained grimly. "When he orchestrated the boating accident that killed your parents, he knew he couldn't simply take the title outright. The Crown heavily scrutinizes sudden successions. So he claimed the role of steward of the duchy, acting in trust until you were legally declared dead. That declaration was supposed to happen this year, on the 25th anniversary of your disappearance." I stared at a photograph of Charles. He was a striking man in his late 50s, with silver hair, sharp cheekbones, and ice-blue eyes that mirrored the chilling emptiness of a predator. "He's been bleeding the estate dry," I noted, tracing a line on a financial flowchart. "Exactly, Your Grace?" Mr. Abernathy nodded. Because he knew our firm would fight his legal ascension to the title, he started funneling the liquid assets of the Montclair Empire, art, offshore accounts, and tech investments into anonymous shell corporations based in the Cayman Islands. But tomorrow night, he plans to execute his most brazen theft yet. Mr. Abernathy clicked a button, bringing up a blueprint of Somerset Castle, the sprawling ancient fortress in Yorkshire that served as the primary seat of the Montclair Dukes. "He has brokered a private deal with a consortium of international developers," the lawyer continued. "He intends to sign a 99-year lease, effectively selling the eastern wing of Somerset Castle and 5,000 acres of prime ancestral hunting land to be turned into a commercial luxury resort. The signing is scheduled to take place tomorrow evening at the Sovereign's Crystal Ball at Whitehall Palace." My blood ran cold. The eastern wing of Somerset Castle was where my mother's memorial gardens were located. It was the only part of my heritage I had left to connect with the parents I never knew. Charles wasn't just stealing money, he was erasing our history. "The contract is null and void without the signature of the reigning duke or duchess," I stated, my fists clenching. "True," Mr. Abernathy agreed, "but he plans to forge a proxy signature, claiming a magistrate has finally signed your death certificate. If that ink dries and the money changes hands, it will take us a decade of international litigation to unravel the mess. We cannot let him sign that document." I stood up, the heavy gold signet ring on my finger catching the harsh fluorescent light of the archive. "Then we make sure he doesn't. Get me on the guest list for the Crystal Ball, Mr. Abernathy. It's time I introduced myself to my uncle." The Sovereign's Crystal Ball was the undisputed pinnacle of the British aristocratic social season. Held in the historic banqueting house at Whitehall Palace, beneath the breathtaking painted ceiling of Peter Paul Rubens, it was an event where billionaires, royals, and politicians gathered to broker deals that shaped the global economy. Arriving uninvited was social suicide. Arriving as a dead woman was something else entirely. Clara Davies, the stylist who had prepared me for the Oakhaven ambush, outdid herself. She had sourced a breathtaking, custom-made emerald green velvet gown that trailed behind me like liquid glass. But the true centerpiece was what Mr. Abernathy had personally retrieved from the ultra-secure underground vaults of the Bank of England earlier that morning. Secured in my swept-up hair was the Montclair Emerald Tiara, a priceless, multi-tiered masterpiece of diamonds and massive Colombian emeralds that had been worn by the Duchesses of Somerset. Montclair for 3 centuries. Around my neck rested a matching collar necklace. I was practically radiating wealth, power, and ancient authority. As my armored Bentley pulled up to Whitehall, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi went into a blinding frenzy. I stepped out, flanked by Mr. Abernathy and 4 towering private security contractors. The moment the press caught sight of the tiara, a wave of stunned shouting erupted from the press pens. They knew exactly what that jewelry meant. The Montclair heir had returned. Inside the banqueting house, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, old money, and whispered secrets. I moved through the grand hall like a ghost haunting a royal court. Conversations died instantly as I passed. Glasses of champagne were lowered. Aristocrats stared in naked shock. I scanned the room, my eyes sweeping past minor royals and tech moguls until I found my target. Lord Charles Montclair was standing in a private, roped-off, VIP alcove near the back of the hall. He was surrounded by 4 men in slick, tailored suits, the international developers. On a small, antique table between them sat a thick stack of leather-bound contracts and a gold fountain pen. Charles was holding a glass of scotch, laughing effortlessly at something one of the developers had said. I didn't hesitate. I marched directly toward the alcove, the crowd parting for me in total, awestruck silence. The 2 bodyguards flanking the VIP ropes stepped forward to block my path, but Mr. Abernathy was faster. He snapped a laminated high court badge in their faces. Official court business. Step aside or face immediate obstruction charges. The guards hesitated, and I slipped past them, coming to a halt just inches from the antique table. Charles looked up, annoyed by the interruption. His icy blue eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. The absolute paralyzing terror of a man who was looking at a ghost. He recognized my face. He saw my mother's cheekbones and my father's defiant jawline. And then his eyes flicked upward to the emerald tiara, and all the blood drained from his face. "Hello, Uncle," I said, my voice smooth, loud, and echoing in the suddenly silent alcove. "I apologize for my tardiness. It's been a long 25 years. The developers looked utterly confused. "Lord Charles," one of them asked, a thick French accent lacing his words, "who is this woman? We were just about to sign the lease." Charles's shock lasted only a moment before the seasoned sociopath within him took over. He slammed his scotch glass onto the table, his face contorting into a mask of righteous fury. "Guards!" Charles barked, his voice dripping with venom. "Arrest this woman immediately. This is an outrage. How dare you parade an impostor into a royal event, Abernathy? I always knew your firm was desperate, but hiring an actress to wear paste jewelry and claim my brother's stolen legacy. This is treasonous." He turned to the developers, waving his hand dismissively. "Gentlemen, please excuse this theatrical nonsense. A pathetic extortion attempt by a disgraced law firm. Let us sign the papers and be done with it." Charles reached for the gold fountain pen. Before his fingers could touch the metal, I slammed my hand down on top of the contracts. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Charles," I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the absolute venom in my voice. "Unless you want to add international wire fraud to your charges of double homicide." "Shh," Charles sneered, leaning in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cigars. "You have nothing, you little street rat. Margaret might have taught you how to act like a lady, but you have no proof. No magistrate will accept a DNA test from a corrupt lawyer. I have the judges in my pocket. I have the bank managers. I am the Duke of Montclair, and you are going to rot in a prison cell for forgery." "Shh! You're right about one thing." A booming, authoritative voice echoed from the edge of the alcove. Charles froze. Pushing through the crowd of stunned aristocrats was an elderly man wearing the ceremonial red robes and heavy gold chains of a chief magistrate of the crown. Behind him were 6 uniformed officers of the Metropolitan Police, heavily armed and looking entirely unamused. It was Lord Justice Sterling, the highest-ranking civil judge in the United Kingdom. "Mr. Abernathy's DNA tests would indeed take months to verify through standard channels," Lord Justice Sterling announced, stepping into the alcove and staring Charles down with absolute disdain. "Which is precisely why His Majesty the King ordered an independent royal medical inquiry 3 days ago, directly supervised by my office." Charles stumbled backward, his arrogant facade finally shattering into pieces. "The King? No. No, that's impossible. You can't. Lord Justice Sterling unrolled a heavy parchment document bearing the massive, intricate wax seal of the British monarchy. By order of the Crown, the genetic identity of Amelia Catherine Diana Montclair is confirmed absolute and irrefutable, the Lord Justice proclaimed, his voice booming across the grand hall. Effective immediately, all proxy stewardships held by Lord Charles Montclair are dissolved. The Duchy of Somerset Montclair is hereby restored to its rightful Duchess. The developers cursed loudly in French, backing away from the table as if it were radioactive. Charles lunged forward, desperately grabbing the contracts, trying to tear them up, trying to do something, anything, to maintain control. But the Metropolitan Police were faster. 2 officers tackled him to the marble floor, slamming his wrists into heavy steel handcuffs. Lord Charles Montclair, the lead officer stated coldly, hauling the struggling aristocrat to his feet. You are under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and the fraudulent sale of Crown-protected lands. Furthermore, you are being held for questioning regarding the murders of Duke William and Duchess Catherine Montclair. This is my estate, Charles screamed, foaming at the mouth, his polished silver hair disheveled as they dragged him through the crowd of horrified socialites. I built this empire. You are nothing but a bastard orphan. You hear me? You are nothing. See, I stood tall, the weight of the emerald tiara pressing down on me, a heavy but welcome burden. I looked at the table, at the pen he had tried to use to sign away my family's legacy. I am the Duchess, I said quietly, to no one but myself. And for the first time in 25 years, the ghosts of the Montclair family could finally rest. Sunlight streamed through the soaring, stained glass windows of Somerset Castle, casting vibrant prisms across the ancient stone floors. Weeks had passed since the sovereign's crystal ball, and the dust was finally beginning to settle on the greatest aristocratic scandal of the century. I had officially relocated to the primary ducal seat in Yorkshire, spending my days working alongside Henry Abernathy to untangle the financial labyrinth my uncle had constructed over 2 decades. The transition from a quiet archivist to a sovereign duchess was staggering. Instead of cataloging old parish records, I was now approving multi-million-pound agricultural grants, managing a staff of 80, and cooperating with detectives from New Scotland Yard. Charles was locked away in a maximum security cell at Belmarsh Prison, awaiting trial for double homicide and grand larceny. He refused to speak, maintaining a wall of arrogant silence. But as financial investigators from Kroll, the premier corporate intelligence agency, tore through his seized assets, they discovered a hidden wall safe in his Mayfair townhouse. Inside that safe was a ledger that unraveled a secret so vile it completely rewrote the history of my relationship with Preston Parker. Mr. Abernathy called me into the castle's library on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, his usually stoic face tight with disgust. He laid a photocopied page of the ledger onto the heavy mahogany desk. Your Grace, we assumed your uncle was acting alone in his financial drain of the estate, Mr. Abernathy began, adjusting his reading glasses. But it appears he was being systematically extorted for the past 5 years, and the person cashing those illicit checks was none other than Brandy Parker. My heart hammered against my ribs. Brandy? How could she possibly have leverage over Charles? Because she knew, Mr. Abernathy said softly. She knew exactly who you were from the very beginning. He handed me a confidential report drafted by the Yard's lead detective. As I read the summary, a deep, chilling nausea settled in my stomach. 5 years ago, when Preston and I first started dating, Brandy had been horrified that her heir was courting a commoner. Being the paranoid snob that she was, she hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my past, hoping to find a scandal she could use to drive me away. The investigator dug deep into my adoptive mother, Margaret. He traced Margaret's previous employment records back to the Montclair household, noting that she had vanished on the exact same night the young Duchess was presumed dead. Brandy put the pieces together, but instead of going to the authorities or the press, she saw a gold mine. She quietly contacted Lord Charles and showed him the proof that the true heir was alive and sleeping under her roof. She demanded a staggering monthly payout to keep you ignorant and hidden at Oakhaven, Mr. Abernathy explained, his voice laced with righteous anger. Charles paid her hundreds of thousands of pounds to ensure you never discovered your true lineage. You weren't a future daughter-in-law to Brandy, Amelia. You were a hostage, an insurance policy. So why did they throw me out? I whispered, my mind racing as the puzzle pieces viciously snapped into place. Because Charles's offshore accounts were finally frozen by our firm's legal pressure 6 months ago, Mr. Abernathy replied. The extortion payments stopped. Oakhaven was crumbling, and Brandy needed a new source of rapid income. She found Richard Ashford and his daughter Victoria. With Charles no longer paying her, you were no longer profitable. She convinced Preston to discard you, assuming you would just disappear back into poverty and take the secret of your identity to the grave. The sheer gravity of the betrayal was suffocating. Preston hadn't just left me for a richer woman. His entire family had commodified my existence, selling my stolen life for a crumbling mansion. I needed to see them. I needed to look them in the eyes. 48 hours later, I walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit visitors' room of a holding facility in central London, flanked by my private security. Brandy and Preston had been arrested the previous night on charges of extortion, blackmail, and conspiracy to conceal a major felony. Preston was led into the room first, wearing a drab gray uniform. He looked hollowed out, his aristocratic arrogance entirely eroded by the harsh reality of the justice system. When he saw me sitting across the metal table in a tailored Chanel coat, he buried his face in his hands and wept. I didn't know, Preston sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically off the concrete walls. Amelia, I swear on my life I didn't know who you were. My mother told me you were just a commoner. She told me you were dragging our family name into the mud. Stop crying, Preston, I commanded, my voice icy and absolute. It doesn't matter if you knew I was a duchess. What matters is how you treated Amelia Hastings. You thought I was a poor girl who loved you with all her heart, and you threw me away like garbage the second a larger checkbook walked into the room. Your ignorance doesn't absolve you. It just proves how deeply shallow you truly are. Brandy was escorted in next. She looked ghastly, devoid of her designer makeup and expensive jewelry. Yet she still managed to lift her chin in a pathetic display of snobbery. You think you've won, don't you? Brandy hissed, sitting down and glaring at me through the reinforced glass partition. You're still the same ungrateful little stray I let live in my house. Your house? I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. That house belonged to me. The food you ate belonged to me. The extortion money you used to buy your designer clothes was stolen from my family's legacy. You traded my parents' tragic deaths for a comfortable lifestyle, Brandy, and now you're going to pay for every single penny. I stood up, adjusting my gloves, and looked down at the ruined mother and son. Ashford is suing you into oblivion, I stated clearly. The Crown is prosecuting you for extortion. When you finally get out of prison, you will have absolutely nothing. No name, no wealth, no legacy. You will be exactly what you always despised. Invisible. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked out of the facility, stepping into the crisp London air, finally completely free of the shadows they had cast over my life. Justice, when backed by the full weight of the British legal system and limitless resources, moves with terrifying efficiency. The trial at the Old Bailey dominated the global news cycle for 3 solid months. Charles attempted to mount an aggressive defense, hiring the most expensive barristers in the country. But the evidence was insurmountable. The financial ledgers, the wire transfers to Brandy Parker, and the unearthed testimony from the original yacht mechanics secured his fate. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at Belmarsh Prison. The man who had stolen my childhood would die behind steel bars. Brandy Parker received 15 years for extortion and conspiracy. Preston, while acquitted of the extortion charges due to a lack of evidence proving he knew of the blackmail, was completely financially ruined by Richard Ashford's brutal civil lawsuits. The last I heard of my former fiancé, he was working the night shift at a cheap motel in the dreary outskirts of Manchester, entirely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his pride. Victoria Ashford had promptly dumped him the day the scandal broke, fleeing back to New York and pretending the entire engagement had never happened. With the villains of my past securely locked away or banished to irrelevance, I finally had the space to rebuild the future. My first major act as the Duchess of Somerset Montclair was to completely overhaul Oakhaven Estate. I refused to live in the house where I had been so deeply betrayed and humiliated. Instead, I established a massive philanthropic trust and completely renovated the 40-room manor. On a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after I'd been thrown out into the rain, I stood on the front steps of the estate and cut a thick red ribbon. The brass plaque affixed to the heavy oak doors now read, "The Margaret Hastings Archival Library and Historical Foundation." I turned the site of my greatest heartbreak into a fully funded world-class educational facility, dedicated to the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep me safe. It provided free housing, grants, and pristine research facilities for working-class historians and scholars who couldn't afford expensive university tuitions. It was the ultimate revenge against Brandy's snobbery, filling her precious exclusive halls with the very people she had always looked down upon. As the crowd of scholars and press applauded, I walked through the manicured hedge mazes, breathing in the scent of the blooming roses. I thought about the scared, heartbroken girl dragging her suitcases down this very driveway. She felt like a lifetime away. I had lost 5 years to a man who never truly loved me, but in return, I gained an empire, a family legacy, and a purpose greater than I could have ever imagined. I was no longer a pawn in a game of aristocratic survival. I was the reigning piece on the board. Walking back toward my waiting Bentley to head home to Somerset Castle, I touched the heavy gold signet ring on my finger. The rampant lion held the broken sword, surrounded by roses. The sword may have been broken by tragedy, but the lineage had survived. And under my watch, it would never be threatened again. What a wild journey from a discarded fiancée to a reigning duchess. Amelia's story proves that sometimes the universe breaks your heart simply to reposition you for your true destiny. Preston and Brandy thought they were trading up, but their greed became the very trap that destroyed their entire world. If you love this unbelievable tale of betrayal, hidden royalty, and epic karma, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a dramatic plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more crazy real-life stories. See you next time.